A widow's lamp hides secrets the living dare not face. Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I'm your host, Urvela. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your comments make this journey shine. Let's begin. The fog that night lay upon Baker Street like a damp woolen shawl, muffling the rattle of cabs and turning the gas lamps into pale islands of wavering gold. I had been detained at a patient's bedside in Paddington, and, returning late, found Holmes seated cross-legged upon the hearth-rug, his violin upon the chair behind him, and the Persian slipper with its masculine treasure of tobacco not far from his reach. He had made a little bivouac for himself with newspapers and a map of the London River from Blackfriars to the Pool, over which his quick grey eyes wandered, as though the very currents could be read like print. "You are late, Watson," said he without looking up. "You have lost one glove and exchanged your stethoscope tubing for a fresher length. The glove is in your pocket, therefore your haste was recent, and the tubing was offered by a chemist rather than a medical outfitter, since it smells faintly of camphor and soap." I was about to remonstrate when Mrs. Hudson's knock, subdued and apologetic, announced a visitor. A lady, slender and veiled, followed our landlady into the sitting-room. She paused upon the threshold with that hesitation which is as much fear as courtesy, and I saw at once the tremor of her gloved hands and the short, controlled breaths that betray a spirit bracing itself against a blow. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" she asked, and the voice beneath the veil was low, well-bred, and to my ear exhausted. Holmes rose and bowed her to the chair nearest the fire. "Pray be seated, madam. You have brought the river with you," she started. "The river? Salt damp upon your skirt hem, and a trace of tar and rope grease upon your left cuff," said he, motioning to the faint smudge that even I could discern. "You have stood not far from the Pool of London within the hour. The docks leave their autograph upon all who attend them. Watson, the brandy." She raised the veil. She was perhaps 35, with that pallor which speaks less of delicacy than of vigils kept. Her eyes, dark and steady, held to Holmes with a look that was almost an appeal. "My name is Margaret Vale," she said. "I am a widow, or I have been these 7 years. Tonight I am told I may not be one after all, and there is a dead man who will not lie still, and a lamp in my window that has brought me an enemy, as well as perhaps a murderer." Holmes steepled his fingers. "You interest me extremely, Mrs. Vale. My husband, John Vale, was mate on the bark Valiant Star," she began. "She put out from Gibraltar and was last sighted, they say, off Ushant in a winter gale. Wreckage was found, but no man of her company ever came ashore. I was left with our little house at St. Catherine's, and a trick of his I have kept for his sake, a lamp at the window every night against his return. You may think it foolish superstition, Mr. Holmes, but it comforted me. And the men at the docks, the pilots and watermen, took off their caps to it as they passed. They called it the widow's lamp for the dead." "A good phrase travels as quickly as any ship," murmured Holmes. "Pray continue." "2 nights ago," said the widow, and her hands tightened upon each other in her lap, "there appeared in the column of deaths in the Times an announcement, 'Vale John, beloved husband of Margaret, to be buried Friday.' There was no address, no church, only that. I was in a state of confusion, for who should publish such a notice? I went first to the parish clerk, who knew nothing of it. Before I could catch my breath, a constable came to my door at St. Catherine's with Inspector Lestrade's card, and I was conducted to the Wapping mortuary to identify a body taken from the river." She stopped. The fire hissed softly as a coal broke in two. "It wore my husband's ring, Mr. Holmes, his initials within and the mark of the jeweller in Bermondsey who fashioned it. The coat, too, a pea jacket of his with a tear in the right pocket where I had mended it with a stitch only I would know. But the face, oh, the river is merciless. Lime had eaten away enough that I could not swear to the features. Yet the ring, it seemed a voice from out of the water. Holmes's eyes had narrowed to slits. And then? Then, she said, and for the first time her composure quivered, the body was stolen. Stolen from the very slab upon which it lay. The mortuary door was locked. The constable on duty found at his chair insensible. When he came to himself, he reported that the place was full of smoke, though no lamp was overturned and no fire set. A watchman swears he saw a light, low and moving, pass from the rear gate toward the river stairs, as if someone carried a lantern cupped in his hand. They found marks upon the flags, wet prints like a man with boots fresh from the water, and a smear of oil upon the mortuary door. Inspector Lestrade says it is the work of river thieves. He says they will sell the clothes and let the current take the rest, but he cannot explain what came this morning. She reached into her reticule and produced a folded paper. Holmes took it with a pair of tongs from the mantel, one of his little daintinesses when documents of uncertain origin were laid before him, and held it to the light. "It is a banker's draft," I observed. "Pay to the order of Margaret Vale, £200. Holmes's lip drew taut for a moment. "And the signature?" "JV," she whispered, with the little flourish my husband made. "But whether that is his hand, I cannot say. I have 2 letters of his from before he sailed. The writing is not unlike, yet it is as though a stranger has learned to speak in his voice." Holmes laid the draft upon the corner of the mantel, far from the fire. "How was it delivered?" "By a boy from the bank in Lower Tower Street. It is drawn upon their house, and they say a gentleman, heavily muffled, deposited the sum yesterday with instructions that it be paid to me this morning. The clerk remembers only that the gentleman's hand smelled strongly of oil. There was a message, too, without an address, left at my door. I found it pinned beneath the lamp, a single line upon common paper. 'For the lamp for the dead, keep it bright.'" "Pinned beneath the lamp," said Holmes. "Yes, the outline of the paper was scorched. I had let the flame burn low. Mr. Holmes, this is wicked, whether it be clever knavery or something worse. And I will confess to you, I am frightened. Last night, for the first time in 7 years, I had a mind to snuff the light. But when the hour came, I could not." Holmes rose and took 2 or 3 turns about the room, his head sunk upon his breast, his long fingers clasped behind him. Such pacing with him was like the quick flight of an eagle in circles, marking out the ground upon which he would presently stoop. He paused at the violin, touched the string with a nail so that it gave a faint, complaining note, and looked again at Mrs. Vale with that sudden keenness which makes the observer feel as if the skin had been removed from his thoughts. "Have you enemies, madam?" "None that I know of." "Neighbours who grudge the lamp?" "There are men who drink and call out coarse jests at it, but they doff their caps all the same. The lamp is something of a custom now. The watermen say it guides them better than the Board of Trade." "Inspector Lestrade believes the body to have been taken by river thieves," said Holmes, more to himself than to us. "Yet thieves seldom return drafts of £200 to their victims. The oil smear at the mortuary, did Lestrade taste it?" "Taste it?" I cried. Holmes waved a hand. "Hush, Watson. One learns as much with the tongue as the eye when oils are in question." "I suppose not." "Well, then we must be our own tasters. Mrs. Vale, is your lamp a common paraffin burner?" "It is my husband's ship's lantern, sir, a brass thing with a thick glass. It burns whale oil, or what the chandlers now call train oil. I buy it at a little shop behind the custom house." Holmes's eye brightened. "You perceive, Watson, a mortuary door smeared with oil that is not mineral but animal. A draught sent from a muffled gentleman whose hand carried the same odour. A light borne low from the rear gate as a seaman carries a lantern in heavy weather. And a notice in the Times that sends a widow to a body dressed in a dead man's coat. You think, I think, Watson, that some man has been at pains to speak in the dialect of the river," said he, and there was a new animation about his mouth. "To what end we shall learn. Mrs. Vale, you have done wisely to come. You shall return to St. Catherine's as you would upon any evening. You shall light your lamp as before and give no sign that you have sought counsel. Watson and I will attend you from a position where we may observe without alarming whoever has made you the centre of this little drama." She rose, and the relief in her face was the more touching because of her effort to restrain it. "I am grateful beyond words, Mr. Holmes." Holmes bowed with that mixture of coldness and courtesy which was natural to him when his mind had already leapt a stage ahead. "We will call upon Inspector Lestrade at Wapping first. There are questions to be put to his constable and to the mortuary keeper. Also a few experiments to be made with oils. Watson, your hat. Mrs. Vale, if any message or gift is delivered in our absence, no matter how innocent, leave it untouched till I have examined it. Above all, keep the lamp burning." As we descended the stairs, the fog pressed at the panes like a living thing eager to enter, and in the street the lamps showed halos as if each burned within a ghostly crown. Holmes drew his collar up and hailed a cab with a whistle that cut through the damp. I confess that a little shiver passed through me which was not due to the night air. There are cases in which the ordinary cunning of man seems joined to some darker pressure behind it. And as we set our course for the river, I could not shake the image of a light moving low along a stair to the water, and of a dead man's ring gleaming upon a hand that should not have had the strength to close. Lestrade received us in a sour temper, which he strove to disguise under official briskness. The little inspector had a look of a terrier that has snapped at a rat and been rewarded with splinters for his pains. Yet, to do him justice, he was already in motion. He had sent men to the bank in Lower Tower Street, others to sound the watermen between Wapping Old Stairs and St. Catherine's, and a third to question the mortuary clerk anew. Holmes's brief commendation, no more than a very proper, soothed him as balm might soothe a burn. "You will find—" "Mr. Holmes," cried Lestrade, leading us along a flagged passage towards the mortuary, "that there was nothing supernatural in it. The thieves had a ladder against the rear wall. The bolt on the yard gate shows signs of oil, and the constable swears to some devilish smoke that set him coughing till he swooned. They are as artful as costermongers and twice as dirty." "Dirty, yes," said Holmes, who had fallen behind to examine the mortar between the flags with the end of his cane, "but costermongers do not bring the sea with them. Observe, Watson, grains of dried salt glittering in the crevice, and here a fibre or two of oakum." He lifted the sticky twist to his nostril. "Tarred, freshly teased. A ship's hand would keep it in his pocket as another man keeps twine." The mortuary gave out its peculiar, flat odour, the cold conjunction of damp stone, carbolic, and the faint iron tang which no purification quite abolishes. The slab upon which the body had lain was now empty, but a dark line where moisture had dried left its silhouette. At the door upon the lower panel was a smear the colour of weak tea. Holmes whipped out his lens and a small penknife, scraped the smear upon the blade and touched it with his tongue. Lestrade made a protesting motion. "I confess I did the same. Spermaceti with a rancid note," said Holmes untroubled, "mixed with train oil. Not a trace of paraffin. Your mortuary lamps burn mineral oil, do they not?" "They do," said the keeper, a grey, nervous fellow who looked as though he had taken the intrusion personally. "Paraffin from the can there, sir." "Then this was not picked up by leaning against your door from within, but brought to it from without," Holmes answered, half to himself. He raised the latch and studied the tongue of iron and the socket into which it fell. "Wiped clean. Your thief is a tidy man. He thinks with his hands. Tell me, my good fellow, have you missed any hooks? A gaff, perhaps?" "A gaff, sir?" The keeper looked blank. "No, sir. Nothing of that sort." Holmes's eyes twinkled. "You shall not find it on your inventory, for it was never here. The print upon the slab shows where a weight was hooked and shifted. See the faint crescent in the dried outline? A gaff head will leave that. They did not carry the man. They drew him." Lestrade sniffed. "Dragged him out like a cod from a well, eh?" "River vermin, as I said." "River hands," Holmes corrected mildly. "Vermin are generalists. This is a specialist. Pray let me see your constable." We found the young man pale and chastened, with a rawness about his eyes as if he had stood too near a peat fire. Holmes had him detail every instant. The stillness of the hour, the tick of the station clock, the first hint of a strange odour, not smoke, sir, more like a lamp turned bad, the sudden billow that stung his throat and filled his head with darkness. Holmes smelled the man's cuffs and hair, then drew out his chemical pocket-case and held a moistened strip to a singed corner of the yard. It browned at once. Saltpetre upon brown paper, he concluded, a common device among navvies to start a fire in wet weather, and among thieves to make smoke without flame. Tipped in oil, smoulders fiercely, offends the eyes, and is harmless when the air clears. Our man prepared his retreat as carefully as his entry. Lestrade rubbed his chin. "And the point of stealing a body?" "The clothes, of course. But there are pawn shops aplenty." "The point," said Holmes, "lies not in what they took, but in what they gave. A notice in the Times, a draft at a bank, a message under a lamp. When a rogue goes to expense, he expects a return. We shall learn the coin in which he thinks to be repaid." He would hear then of the bank messenger. The clerk, prompted by Lestrade's authority and Holmes's swift, precise questions, yielded more than he knew he had. The depositor had worn a scarf high about his mouth and a cap with the brim pulled low. His right glove was stained at the thumb by something that had wept through the seams. He wrote his instructions with his left hand, but propped the pen in a manner habitual to right-handed men. Practiced inversion, Holmes murmured, and took up the slip on which the clerk had jotted the man's phrasing. It was an odd turn. For the comfort of the widow Vale against her lamp, Holmes's eye brightened, and he folded the slip carefully. "You will keep the bank upon its guard," said he to Lestrade. "If our gentleman returns, he is to be cordially received and detained upon any pretext. Meanwhile, I desire a list of those chandlers within a half-mile of the pool who still sell train oil, and the names of their regular customers. Come, Watson. We will pay a boy 6pence to run the list to Baker Street, and then our course is towards St. Catherine's." The fog had thickened so that the lamps hung in it, like moons sunk in a shallow sea. The river gave a slow mutter, as if it slept and talked in its sleep. We left Lestrade posting a man at the yard gate and another at the bank corner, and took a hansom eastward, the horse's flanks shining wet under the smear of light. Holmes was sunk in that profound silence which I had learned not to break. Once only he spoke, and then so softly that the driver could not have heard. "A lamp for the dead," he said. A message scorched at its foot. "Oil here, oil there. Money given, not taken. A body borrowed. There is piety in the pattern, Watson. Piety, or something dressed to resemble it. When the wicked pay for virtue, it is because they expect change." We sat down in a narrow lane that gave upon the river, where the black ribs of stairs ran down between slick stones. St. Catherine's, much altered since the building of the docks, had still its pockets of the old life, sailors' lodgings with painted signs, a public house whose windows showed a red fire, a cooper's yard perfumed with staves and sawdust. At the far end, a single window burned with a steady golden eye. I knew without being told that it was Mrs. Vale's lamp. Holmes touched my sleeve and drew me into the shadow of a low shed, whose roof almost met the wall beyond. From this point, we could command the widow's door, the strip of pavement beneath the lamp, and the river stairs that fell away to our right. The faint reek of oil was everywhere, a thing that belongs to the docks as surely as tar and the faint jangle of chains. "Mark the lamp," Holmes whispered. "Ship's brass, glass thick as a finger. The flame is trimmed clean. See how the chimney stays clear. Our man knows such a lamp as he knows his hand. Hush." Footsteps came out of the fog, unhurried, with that rolling cadence which betrays a sailor, even when he wears a clerk's boots. A figure drifted into the penumbra of the window, muffled, hat-brim low, a parcel under his arm. He paused at the door as if to knock, and did not. Instead, he stepped to the lamp, and for a moment his head bowed to it in a curious, reverent attitude. His left hand lifted. Something small glinted between finger and thumb. He reached beneath the lamp as one might tuck a child's toy upon a windowsill. And in that instant, Holmes's hand left my sleeve. He was out of the shadow and upon the man with a movement so swift that the muffled figure barely had time to turn. There was a scuffle, the thud of a shoulder against brick, and the parcel fell. I sprang and seized the fellow's other arm. He twisted with surprising power. His hat flew and the gaslight took his cheek, a pale, scarred wedge with an old burn puckering it. And then, with the eel-like dexterity of his kind, he writhed free, flung an object hard against the pavement, so that it burst into a choking cloud, and was out and down the river stairs like a wraith. By the time we reached the top step, there was nothing but the slap of a boat against wood, and the ripple of a wake that the fog erased as a hand erases chalk. Holmes did not attempt the pursuit. He stooped where the parcel had fallen, and where the little thing the man had tucked had come to rest, no longer hidden by his hand. He held it up to the lamplight with that grim satisfaction, which with him was as near to triumph as he allowed himself. "A taper," said he softly, "soaked in oil and saltpetre, and this." He opened the parcel. Within lay a folded sheet and a narrow band of metal that caught the light in a dull gleam. A message and a ring to seal it, though not the ring we have already heard of. "Come, Watson. We have frightened our bird from the hedge. Now we shall watch where he settles." The acrid vapour from the burst taper still hung about the widow's threshold, though the night air was beginning to thin it. Holmes stooped over the object left behind, a folded sheet sealed with a common wafer, and the narrow band of metal which he had already remarked upon. He placed both into his pocketbook with a care that told me he valued them highly. Mrs. Vale, who had rushed to her door at the sound of the scuffle, stood trembling in the lamplight. Her hand pressed to her breast. "You are unharmed, madam?" Holmes asked quickly. Yes, sir. But what has happened? Who was that man? What did he leave? Holmes held up his long hand in warning. It is best you do not know until I have sifted the matter. For the present, continue exactly as before. Leave your lamp burning nightly. Show no alteration in your habits. And if another communication is delivered, touch it not until I come. She assented, though her eyes clung to Holmes as though to an anchor in rough water. He bowed gravely and drew me away, taking the river stair rather than the street, his step light and eager. A waterman, startled at the sudden hail from the gloom, rowed us upriver to a quieter landing near Billingsgate. Only once we were alone in the cab that carried us back towards Baker Street did Holmes open the folded sheet. The writing within was cramped and laborious, as if a man not accustomed to the pen had been at pains to disguise his strokes. The message was brief. She shall not lack while the flame is kept. By the river's oath, so long as the lamp burns, her comfort is assured. Holmes's lips curved. An oath of the river, Watson. Seamen swear by many things, but seldom by the water that bears them. Curious. And the ring? He turned it in his fingers. It was a plain band of brass, such as may be cut from a ship's chronometer spring, with a rough engraving upon its inner surface. 2 letters clumsily incised, J.V., the initials of her husband. I cried. Or their counterfeit, said Holmes. The hand that scarred the brass did not hold a graver often. Yet he knew enough to mimic. Combine this with the sailor's gait, the oil smear, the oakum. Our quarry is of the water, Watson. But whether he emerges from it as a friend or foe, that we have yet to learn. Back at Baker Street, Holmes cleared the table of his chemical clutter and set to work upon the taper. He scraped a grain of its substance into a flame. It flared with a white brightness and left a greasy residue. Saltpeter and whale oil, a mixture made not for light but for signal. The same materials left their trace at the mortuary. Our man bears them constantly. He is more than a casual dock thief. He lives by such contrivances. I ventured that it might be some fellow sailor of Vale's preserving a twisted loyalty. Holmes shook his head. Loyalty speaks in private acts, Watson. Here we have pageants, notices in the Times, drafts at the bank, messages under the lamp. A mind is at work which delights in theatre. He desires an audience as much as a result. He said no more, but sat for long with his chin upon his hands, the sheet and the ring before him. At last he rose with abrupt decision. Come, we shall have the list of Chandlers from Lestrade by morning. Tonight we walk. Thus it was that I found myself pacing beside him through the narrow byways east of Tower Hill, our breath hanging in the raw fog, our boots echoing on cobbles still wet from the tide. Holmes halted at corners, sniffed the air like a hound, studied the lanterns hung outside taverns, and marked the heaps of rope and timber stacked in the yards. More than once he bent suddenly, lifting a rag or a twist of fibre from the gutter, muttering to himself before flinging it aside. At length we came upon a little shop tucked behind the custom house, its shutters fastened, but its interior glimmering faintly with the dull glow of oil. Holmes tried the handle. It yielded, and within we found a bent old man filling cans from a cask that smelt rankly of fish and brine. Late business, said Holmes cheerily. Train oil, I presume. The old man nodded, his eyes bleared with age. Seafaring folk, sir. They'll have it for lamps, for polish, for all manner. The watermen, the pilots, them as keep their lanterns true. Holmes questioned him lightly, but his purpose was clear. Did a man scarred at the cheek, with a seaman's role trade here often? Did he buy in bulk and lately? The answer came slowly but with certainty. Yes, such a man had stood there only yesterday, drawing a quart into a tin can and paying with good coin. He had said little, but the old man remembered the scar, the smell of tar upon him, and the way he handled the lamp displayed upon the counter, like one as knew every bolt in her. We left the shop and Holmes clapped his gloved hands once together as though the game were afoot. There is our proof, Watson. The scarred sailor is no phantom but a customer of long habit. He has moved already to bind his fate with Mrs. Vale's lamp. Why, to preserve her? To torment her? Or to draw us all into some deeper design? Whatever his purpose, he will not resist returning to the flame he has claimed. We must be there to meet him. The fog swallowed his words, but I felt the conviction in them. The case was no longer a puzzle of a stolen body alone. It was unfolding into a design whose edges I glimpsed only faintly. As we turned homeward, The image rose again before me of the scarred man bowing before the widow's lamp, his hand raised in reverence, and I could not banish the uneasy thought that in that flame he saw not remembrance, but possession. The lamps of Baker Street still burned when we returned, their glow blurred by the creeping fog. Holmes did not pause to divest himself of cloak or gloves, but went directly to the table, where he had left the ring and the message. He laid beside them the new fragment of evidence from the chandler's shop, a rag smeared with the same fishy oil. For some minutes he regarded the little collection in silence, as though weighing them on some inner scale. Then he sank into his chair, fingers steepled, and closed his eyes. I knew better than to disturb him, but the strangeness of the affair pressed heavily upon me, and I found myself pacing the room like a caged man. At last, Holmes stirred. "We are upon the scent, Watson, but the quarry doubles back upon his trail. Consider. A notice in the Times, a banker's draft, a stolen corpse, a taper, a ring. Each of these is a gesture, and each directed not at concealment but at revelation. This is not the work of a man hiding guilt. It is the work of one who desires his actions to be seen, though not his face. Then the motive is intimidation?" I suggested. Holmes opened his eyes and gave me one of his rare approving nods. "Very near. But intimidation implies fear, and Mrs. Vale is not the target of fear alone. She is the pivot. The lamp she keeps nightly is the stage upon which our man acts. He wishes her to believe that some covenant exists between the flame and her welfare, and he will furnish signs to reinforce it. Did you note his reverence, Watson? The way he bowed to the light. That was no mere affectation. He believes himself part of some ritual. But to what end? He cannot profit by scattering money and gifts. Cannot? Or believes that he may yet gather profit from the confusion he creates. We must learn which." Holmes rose suddenly and took up the poker, stabbing at the fire as though it were the enemy itself. Sparks flew up the chimney. "There is one man who can assist us. Lestrade has blunt instruments enough, but we require a mind acquainted with the currents of the river, one who knows how men disappear and reappear upon its tide. Happily, I have such a fellow among my irregulars. Watson, you recall Wiggins?" The name brought back the image of the sharp-eyed urchin who had so often done Holmes's bidding. Within an hour, Wiggins stood at the door, his cap askew and his grin irrepressible despite the lateness of the hour. Holmes gave him a few curt instructions, pressing a coin into his palm. The boy's eyes widened at the promise of more if he returned with results. He darted off like a ferret into the fog. "By noon," said Holmes, "we shall know where our scarred sailor haunts, with whom he drinks, and what craft he calls his own." Morning brought a pale light through the window, and with it Lestrade, bustling in with the air of a man who wishes to preempt reproach by excess energy. He had the list of chandlers, which matched precisely with the one we had already investigated, and a new report from the constables. The body stolen from the mortuary had not been recovered. Yet rumours ran along the docks of a barge seen at night, low in the water, its single lantern shuttered and unshuttered 3 times as it passed St. Catherine's. Holmes seized upon this eagerly. "A signal, Watson. You observe the consistency. Oil for the lamp, a taper for fire, and now a light upon the river. All point to one theme, illumination. Our man uses light as his emblem, his weapon, his means of communication." Before Lestrade could comment, Wiggins burst in, breathless with triumph. "I've found him, Mr. Holmes. Scar on his cheek, right enough. They call him Caleb Pike down Wapping way. He used to be a fireman aboard the Valiant Star, the very ship Mr. Vale was lost from. He lodges near the old stairs and keeps to himself, but the tavern folk say he's half mad with religion. Talks of oaths on the water and lamps to guide the dead. And, sir," Wiggins's eyes shone, "he was seen last night hiring a skiff, muffled up, carrying something heavy wrapped in sacking." Holmes's hand fell upon the boy's shoulder. "Excellent, Wiggins. You have served the lamp of knowledge as faithfully as Mrs. Vale has hers." He dismissed the lad with further reward, then turned to Lestrade. "You see, Inspector, the game is afoot indeed. Our scarred friend is no nameless thief, but a man bound by old ties to the missing mate. That opens many doors. But if Pike was a fireman aboard the Valiant Star," I interposed, "then he must have shared the same fate as Vale. How is he here alive?" Holmes's gaze grew keen. "Precisely the question, Watson. He survived where Vale was lost, or perhaps where Vale was not lost at all. For if Pike lives, why not Vale? And if Vale lives, then this masquerade of corpses and rings may mask a resurrection rather than a death. Lestrade gave a snort. You don't mean to say Vale has been hiding 7 years, and chooses this moment to return with tricks and tapers? Preposterous. Preposterous things, said Holmes dryly, have a way of proving true in my experience. For the present we shall test Pike. Inspector, I require you to set a watch upon him, but to approach with delicacy. If you clap him in irons too soon, you may lose the larger fish. Lestrade grudgingly agreed, and after he departed, Holmes turned to me with that restless energy that meant we were close upon the crux. There is but one way to resolve the doubt, Watson. Tonight we must again station ourselves near Mrs. Vale's lamp. Pike cannot resist it. He will return, whether to leave another token, to deliver another oath, or to draw her more tightly into his web. And when he does, we must be ready, not to startle him into flight, but to follow, to the very lair where he keeps the secret of the widow's lamp. As the day waned and the fog thickened anew, I could not help the chill that crept over me. The image of Caleb Pike, scarred and half-mad, bowing in reverence before a dead man's light, seemed to carry with it the weight of something both sinister and sacrilegious. And as Holmes prepared our vigil once more, I knew that whatever the night revealed, it would lead us deeper into a mystery whose heart was darker than the river that bore it. The fog that night seemed heavier than the last, rolling in dense folds about the river stairs and pressing close against the window panes of St. Catherine's. Holmes and I had taken our post earlier than before, concealed in the same shadowed shed from which we had first observed the scarred sailor. Mrs. Vale's lamp shone steady and golden, a small defiance against the gloom, its flame burning clear in the thick glass. Holmes had positioned himself so that he could command both the river stairs and the patch of pavement beneath the window, his eyes glittering with the intensity of a hawk watching a field. For near an hour there was no movement, save the silent breathing of the river and the occasional creak of timber from the dock. Then, faint but distinct, came the dip of oars. A skiff emerged, its outline just discernible against the faint shimmer of water. One man rowed muffled in cloak and cap, and in the bow lay a bulky shape covered by sacking. The boat touched lightly against the lower step. The rower shipped his oars, heaved the burden to his shoulder, and began to climb. Pike, Holmes murmured, barely audible. Mark his reverence, Watson. He will pause. The figure reached the top and halted beneath the lamp as though compelled. He bowed his head, then laid the sacking gently upon the stones. With careful fingers, he drew forth a slip of paper and placed it against the base of the lantern. I felt Holmes tense beside me, and in the next instant he was in motion. He moved with the noiseless swiftness of a cat, and I followed as best I could. Hold, Pike. Holmes's voice cut the fog like a whip. The man started, his scarred cheek livid in the lamplight. For a moment he seemed poised to flee, but Holmes was upon him, one hand iron on his shoulder. Pike's eyes flashed with wildness, yet he did not strike. Instead he uttered a low, hoarse cry that seemed half prayer, half oath. "You shall not take him from the flame," he cried. "By the river's oath he belongs to the light." At Holmes's gesture I bent and tore away the sacking. Within lay the body of a man, gaunt, waterlogged, the face blurred by river's cruelty but the clothing still sound. A sailor's jacket, torn at the right pocket, with the unmistakable mark of a woman's hand where it had been stitched. I heard Mrs. Vale's gasp from the doorway, where the commotion had drawn her. "My husband," she whispered, clutching the frame for support. Holmes straightened, his face hard. "So this is your offering, Pike. You dress the corpse in Vale's garb, you place him beneath the widow's lamp, and you think to sanctify your deception with oaths and oil. What is your game?" The sailor's eyes darted between us, fever bright. "Not deception, salvation. The lamp must burn. It binds the living and the dead. He is not lost if the flame is kept. She must never quench it." Holmes's hand tightened on his shoulder. "Nonsense, man. Speak plainly. Where is John Vale?" At that, Pike broke into wild laughter, then choked upon it. "Where is he?" "Where the sea takes all. I saw him go under, but his oath was to the lamp, and so I keep it for him. His ring, his coat, his name in the paper, it is his voice through me. She must believe or he is lost forever." Holmes shot me a swift glance that I knew well. It meant he had touched the edge of truth but required proof. He drew Pike aside, speaking low and fierce. "You think to play priest to the river, Pike, but I know better. These drafts, these gifts, this theatre, you are no mad saint. You are serving another's design." Who gives you the money? Who bade you place notices in the press? Answer me. For a moment Pike resisted, his lips drawn tight. Then, with a sudden wrench, he slipped from Holmes's grasp and fled headlong down the stairs. Holmes gave pursuit, but the man had the strength and swiftness of desperation. By the time we reached the river's edge, the skiff was already a black blur on the misty water, vanishing into the night. Holmes stood motionless, breathing hard. Then he turned sharply and strode back to the widow's door. The body still lay where it had been unwrapped. Holmes knelt, his lens in hand, and examined every inch with tireless care. At last he gave a soft exclamation and pointed to the inner lining of the jacket. There, barely visible, was a mark in red thread, a ship's insignia not belonging to the Valiant Star at all. Ha! So our corpse is no sailor of that ship. Pike has clothed a stranger in Vale's garments. Why? To persuade Mrs. Vale of her husband's return, or to mask some deeper treachery? He rose, his gaze blazing. Watson, we are closer than ever. Pike is but the hand. Another is the brain. He is supplied, directed, and compelled to act this grotesque ritual. We must uncover who stands behind him, and for what end. And for what end? Mrs. Vale, pale and trembling, clung to the doorframe. Mr. Holmes, what am I to believe? Was that my husband or not? Why does this man torment me so? Holmes's tone softened, though his eyes remained keen. Believe nothing, madam, save this. We will not cease until the truth is laid bare. For the present, keep your lamp burning. It is the lure that will draw your enemy into the open. And when he comes again, we shall be ready. As we withdrew into the fog, I could feel the weight of the mystery pressing heavier upon us. The scarred sailor had played his part, but the hand that guided him remained unseen. Holmes's silence in the cab back to Baker Street was more eloquent than speech. His eyes burned with that inward fire I'd come to know, the certainty that the web was tightening, and that the spider at its center would soon reveal itself. The dawn broke dim and colorless over London, the mist still clinging to the eaves, as though reluctant to surrender the night's secrets. Holmes had not closed his eyes. He sat in his armchair, knees drawn up, pipe cold at his side, his gaze fixed upon the ring and the paper Pike had left beneath the widow's lamp. I had dozed in my chair opposite him, but his sudden movement roused me fully. He sprang up with the vigor of one newly awakened. The corpse, Watson. That is the fulcrum upon which this affair turns. Pike dresses an unknown body in Vale's garments, then offers it beneath the lamp, as though it were a sacred relic. The question is not why Pike acts so, but for whose profit. I ventured that Pike might be deluded, his religion of the lamp a mania born of grief. Holmes shook his head with impatience. Delusion alone does not purchase drafts at a bank, nor place notices in the Times. No, there is a purse behind him, and a hand that writes the script of this grotesque play. Pike is but the actor. At that moment Lestrade bustled in, his face flushed with irritation. Well, Mr. Holmes, we had Pike last night within our grasp, and now he's vanished. I've posted men from Wapping to Limehouse, but the river swallows its own, and the corpse, gone too, spirited away before dawn. The constable left to guard it swears he was lured aside by a cry for help, and when he returned the body was gone. Holmes gave a tight smile. As I predicted, the corpse was never meant for the coroner's inspection. It was a prop, Lestrade, and like all stage properties, it has been whisked away once its scene was done. Lestrade muttered darkly, but Holmes turned away, his mind racing. Tell me, Inspector, what of John Vale's estate? Was there property, money, anything that might tempt a knave to forge his resurrection? Lestrade scratched his head. A small house, some savings, nothing that would account for drafts of £200. Unless, he paused, there was talk of a disputed cargo aboard the Valiant Star. Insurance, I believe. Vale's name might yet be of value to the right scoundrel. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Precisely. A man presumed dead at sea, whose widow keeps vigil with a lamp, becomes the ideal phantom for another's scheme. Pike, with his scarred face and seaman's gait, is set to play the apostle, weaving superstition into evidence. But behind him, who profits? That is our quarry. He snatched up his coat and beckoned me. Watson, we must see the shipping records. The Board of Trade will tell us what cargo the Valiant Star bore, and whose hands stood to lose or gain by her fate. At the board we were received by a clerk, a neat fellow who grew nervous under Holmes's rapid questioning. The ship had indeed carried valuable freight, a consignment of copper ingots insured by a firm in Tower Street. The loss had been paid out 7 years past, but rumor persisted that some of the cargo had been salvaged and sold quietly. The firm's name was Mortlake & Sons. Holmes's brows lifted slightly at the mention. Mortlake & Sons, he repeated as we stepped out into the street. An old house, though not unblemished. There was scandal once, insurance claims settled too readily, and whispers of collusion with shipmasters. Suppose, Watson, that John Vale did not drown, but lived to know of the fraud. His silence would be bought, his name manipulated. And if he did drown, then his ghost becomes a tool in their hands. We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes sent another message to Wiggins. The boy was to haunt Mortlake's office, to watch who came and went, and above all to keep eyes sharp for any man who matched Pike's description. As evening drew near, Holmes grew restless. He played snatches upon his violin, paced the carpet until it wore beneath his heels, and spoke only in short bursts. At last, near dusk, Wiggins returned, his cheeks flushed with the thrill of discovery. Pike was there, Mr. Holmes, scar and all. I saw him slip in by the side door like he'd business there. Stayed near an hour, then out again with a parcel under his arm. Holmes's mouth set in a thin line. So the apostle pays his temple a visit. Mortlake & Sons are indeed the hand behind the ritual. The drafts, the notices, the stage play of the lamp, all financed from their coffers. But why? What do they seek to secure by tormenting a widow with her husband's ghost? Perhaps to frighten her into surrendering her house or savings, I suggested. Holmes dismissed this with a wave. Petty gain, Watson. No, there is larger profit at stake. The lamp is their lever. By it they mean to control the widow's testimony, to keep her bound to a belief that serves their scheme. We must break that chain. Even as he spoke, a knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Vale herself entered, pale and trembling, a letter clutched in her hand. Mr. Holmes, another message. It was left upon my sill not an hour past. Holmes took it delicately, broke the seal and scanned the contents. His eyes darkened. Watson, observe. They grow bolder. The letter read, The body has risen from the river and returned to the flame. Keep your lamp, widow, and you shall never want. But if the light fails, he is lost, and with him all that was promised. Trust the oath of the river, for it binds life and death. Holmes folded the paper with care. It is a chain indeed, links of superstition forged by knaves meant to bind a woman's soul. Pike is their tool, Mortlake their purse. But what treasure lies hidden beneath this masquerade? That, Watson, we must learn, and soon, for the lamp has become both beacon and bait, and those who play with such fire seldom scruple to burn what stands in their way. His eyes glittered as he turned back to Mrs. Vale, and I felt the tide of the case drawing us toward a confrontation where truth and falsehood would at last collide. Holmes read the letter again, slowly, as if to wring every drop of meaning from its phrases, his lips pressed together in that thin line which always foretold to me the sharpening of his mind. Mrs. Vale sat trembling in the chair by the fire, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that the knuckles whitened. I could see that the repeated assaults upon her nerves, the corpse, the scarred sailor, the mysterious drafts and notices, were beginning to wear her spirit thin. Holmes turned suddenly to her with a gentleness one might not expect from him. Madam, I must ask you to summon every ounce of courage you possess. Your lamp is no longer merely a light in a window. It has become the instrument by which villains seek to bind you. If you falter, they succeed. If you remain steadfast, we may yet draw them into the open. She nodded faintly. I shall do as you say, Mr. Holmes. I have little else to cling to. Holmes paced the length of the room. They speak of promises bound to the lamp. Very well. Let us test whether those promises are genuine or counterfeit. Tonight, Watson, we shall alter the play. I asked him what he meant, but he only smiled grimly. Patience. You shall see. For now, we must return to the river and learn more of Mortlake's connection to Pike. Lestrade must be brought in, but with discretion. If we alarm the villains too soon, they may vanish altogether, leaving us with shadows. By noon, we were once again in the streets near Tower Street, the fog having thinned enough to reveal the dark outlines of warehouses and counting-houses. Holmes sent me to make discreet inquiries among the clerks, while he disappeared into a neighbouring tavern where seamen and dockmen gathered. When we reconvened an hour later, his expression told me he had struck gold. Watson, the tale grows clearer. Mortlake & Sons paid handsomely for silence 7 years ago. Rumour holds that Vale had knowledge of certain ingots salvaged from the wreck. ingots that were quietly sold, the proceeds divided. If Vale lived, his testimony could destroy them. If Vale died, his name still served. Thus the widow is the key. Her lamp, her belief, her voice, all can be wielded in Mortlake's favor if ever suspicion should be raised. Then Pike, a creature of theirs, perhaps once Vale's shipmate, scarred and half-mad, but valuable as the prophet of their new religion. By making Mrs. Vale believe in the lamp's covenant, they ensure her silence and obedience. The drafts are but bait, the corpse a false miracle, the letters, scripture for a faith they invent. Lestrade joined us presently, though he grumbled at being summoned to stand idle in a tavern corner while Holmes explained his theory. Yet even the inspector's skepticism waned as the pieces aligned. He promised to set plainclothes men near Mortlake's premises, though Holmes warned him not to interfere until given signal. That evening we made our way once more to St. Catherine's. Holmes had contrived a little device, with the aid of a chemist, a lantern made to resemble Mrs. Vale's but fitted with a mechanism by which the flame could be extinguished from without. "Tonight," he whispered, "we shall see whether the lamp is indeed their idol. When the flame dies, if our adversary is watching, he must act. And then, Watson, we shall learn more in 1 hour than in a week of waiting." Mrs. Vale trembled at the plan, but Holmes reassured her. "You shall keep indoors, madam, and let no fear overcome you. Watson and I shall be near. At the moment appointed, I shall quench the flame. If they come, we are ready. If they do not, then our case is flawed indeed." Thus it was that we crouched once more in the shadows by the shed, the true lamp hidden, Holmes's counterfeit shining in its place. The night deepened, the fog muffled every sound. For long minutes nothing stirred. Then, as though conjured from the mist itself, a figure glided to the foot of the stairs. It was Pike. He looked up at the lamp, and I could see his lips move in silent prayer. Holmes's hand tightened on my arm, and with a deft twist of the device the flame guttered and died. The effect was instant. Pike uttered a strangled cry, half anguish, half fury. He fell to his knees, pounding the stones with his fists. "The light! The light is gone! He is lost!" His voice carried through the fog with dreadful intensity. Then, as though summoned by his outcry, another shadow emerged, broad, cloaked, deliberate. Holmes hissed under his breath. "There, Watson," the master behind the actor. The second man seized Pike by the collar and shook him. "Fool, did I not bid you keep her faithful? If the flame is quenched, all is undone." His voice was harsh, authoritative. Pike whimpered like a chastised child. Holmes stepped forward, his revolver leveled. "Stay where you are, gentlemen. The play is over and the curtain has fallen." The cloaked man started back, his hand darting to his side, but Lestrade's men, whom Holmes had summoned earlier, emerged from the shadows to cut off his retreat. For the first time we had the upper hand. Pike cowered, but the taller man straightened, his features revealed in the lamplight of a constable's bull's-eye. It was Mr. Mortlake himself, the senior partner of the firm. Holmes's face betrayed neither triumph nor surprise. As I suspected, the insurer turned playwright, staging his miracle to bind a widow's silence. "Your scheme has been clever, Mortlake, but it has played too long. Now you must answer for corpse-stealing, for fraud, and for the torment of an innocent woman." Mortlake's lips curled, but he did not speak. Pike, however, began to babble incoherently, calling upon the river's oath and the dead man's promise, until Lestrade silenced him with a sharp command. The constables led them both away, leaving Holmes, Mrs. Vale, and myself in the dim street. Holmes turned to the trembling widow. "You see, madam, the lamp's power lay not in its flame, but in the greed of men who sought to use it. Its covenant was false. You are free of it now." She clasped his hand in silent gratitude, tears glistening in her eyes. Holmes inclined his head gravely, then turned away, already deep in thought. "Yet one question remains, Watson. If Pike was but a puppet and Mortlake the hand, who forged the first string that tied them to John Vale's name? Until we answer that, the river still holds its secret." And with that, the night seemed to close about us once more, promising revelations yet to come. The capture of Pike and Mortlake might have seemed a conclusion to some, but I knew Holmes too well to mistake it for anything more than the unmasking of a stage villain, while the true drama remained concealed. Even as Lestrade congratulated himself on a tidy arrest, Holmes's gaze was distant, as though the river mist still veiled the heart of the mystery. Mrs. Vale had been escorted home by a kindly neighbour, reassured by Holmes's grave assurances, yet the weight in his voice lingered with me long after we had returned to Baker Street. Holmes took little rest that night. He sat at his desk, the counterfeit lamp beside him, its flame extinguished. The brass ring and Mortlake's letter lay in a neat row before him. His eyes moved from one to the other, his long fingers drumming upon the table. I ventured a remark about Mortlake's guilt, but he silenced me with a sharp gesture. Mortlake profits, yes, but he is not the origin. A man of commerce does not squander money on rituals unless driven by necessity. He sought to preserve silence, to keep the widow enthralled, but the design began elsewhere. Pike's frenzy is genuine, his devotion real, too real to have been invented whole by Mortlake's ledger-keeping mind. No, Watson, there is another voice, one older, deeper, which first sowed this creed of the lamp. The following morning brought confirmation of Holmes's unease. Lestrade arrived sheepish but excited with word from the yard. Mortlake had refused to speak, but Pike, broken by confinement, had raved all night in his cell. His ramblings circled always back to the same theme, the oath sworn by John Vale himself on the night of the storm. He claimed Vale had entrusted him with a covenant, that the lamp at St. Catherine's was to be his beacon, that through it his wife would be provided for, and that Pike was charged to keep the flame. Holmes listened intently, his eyes narrowing. You see, Watson? Mortlake seized upon Pike's superstition, fashioned it into theatre and used it as a lever. But the root is in Vale. Alive or dead, he spoke words that bound Pike's mind, and from that seed all else has sprung. Therefore, to solve this case, we must know whether John Vale perished or survived. Our next course led us to the Seamen's Registry, where Holmes demanded the names of all crewmen of the Valiant Star. Most were marked dead or missing after the wreck, but one or two had survived, clinging to wreckage and later picked up by a fishing boat off Ushant. Among these was a certain Abel Corrin, now living in Shadwell. Holmes wasted no time. By afternoon we were in a narrow court reeking of tar and stale beer, knocking at the door of a squalid lodging. A gaunt man with hollow eyes admitted us, his back bent from years of labour. When Holmes mentioned the Valiant Star, he flinched as if struck. John Vale? Holmes asked sharply. Corrin nodded slowly. Aye, he was mate. A steady hand, a good man. He went down in the storm, or so we thought. His eyes clouded. But there was talk after. Pike swore he saw him cling to a spar alive, calling out to the lamp that his wife kept. I thought it madness, yet Pike held to it, swore by it as gospel. Holmes pressed him with questions, but Corrin could add little. Only this. Before the voyage, Vale had confided unease about the cargo, hinting at fraud and a plot to scuttle the vessel. He feared Mortlake, Corrin said the sea might claim him, but his wife's lamp would prove him still present in the world. Holmes's eyes gleamed. There, Watson. The seed, indeed. Vale's words, spoken in dread, became Pike's creed. Mortlake seized it to cloak his fraud. But whether Vale died or lived, there lies our answer. We left Corrin, and Holmes walked swiftly, his head sunk in thought. If Vale lives, he may be the architect still, hiding in shadow while Mortlake does his bidding. If he died, then Mortlake's cunning has been to use his memory as weapon. In either case, the lamp remains the fulcrum. Tonight, Watson, we must turn it against them. That evening we returned once more to St. Catherine's. Holmes had arranged with Lestrade that the yard men keep well out of sight. Only Mrs. Vale knew we were there, and she bore herself with quiet bravery. Holmes replaced the counterfeit lantern with the true one, its flame burning steady. Then he produced from his pocket a scrap of copper, marked faintly with the same insignia Holmes had found on the false corpse's jacket. This, he whispered, was not from Vale's ship, but from the salvaged ingots. Pike carried it once and dropped it when he fled. Tonight we return it to the flame. If any watcher lingers in the fog, he will take it as sign. He will come. And we shall be ready. We crouched in silence. The fog thickened until the lamplight seemed a halo suspended in air. Hours dragged by. Then faintly the dip of oars. A skiff slid into view, more carefully muffled than Pike's, rowed by a man with the ease of long practice. He ascended the stairs slowly, paused beneath the lamp and extended a hand toward the copper token Holmes had left there. Holmes moved like lightning. "John Vale!" he cried. The man wheeled, the lamplight falling full upon his face. Gaunt, aged, yet unmistakable. It was the very likeness I had seen in the widow's trembling hands when she clutched her husband's portrait. He stood frozen, his eyes wild before Holmes's revolver. "Alive," Holmes murmured. "Alive and hiding in the river's cloak all these years." "Watson, the play is at its climax." Vale's lips parted, but no words came. Only the river muttered below, as though echoing secrets it had kept too long. For a moment that seemed to stretch without end. None of us moved. John Vale stood transfixed beneath the glow of the lamp, his gaunt features carved into a mask of shock, defiance, and something deeper, fear. Mrs. Vale, drawn by the sound of Holmes's cry, had rushed to her doorway. She froze as if the very marrow of her bones had turned to ice. Her hand rose to her mouth, and a single name, trembling and broken, escaped her lips. "John!" The man flinched as though struck. His eyes darted toward her, then back to Holmes's revolver. He made a sudden movement as if to retreat to the river stairs, but Holmes was already upon him, his long arm seizing Vale's wrist with the strength of iron. "No further, sir," he said coldly. "You have haunted the river long enough. Tonight the haunting ends." Vale sagged under the grip, his strength seeming to drain. "I did not wish her to see me thus," he muttered hoarsely. "Not like this. Better a ghost than a broken man." Mrs. Vale stepped forward, trembling from head to foot. "You are alive? All these years, alive? Why hide from me?" Holmes released his wrist but remained between them, watchful as a falcon. "That, madam, is the crux of the matter, and we shall hear it plainly. Speak, Vale. The lamp has burned long enough in silence." The sailor's eyes burned with a fevered light. "It was Mortlake. He swore the Valiant Star would not return. He promised me a share if I kept my tongue about the cargo. But when the storm came, I knew he meant us to founder. I clung to a spar, Pike beside me. He swore he saw me live, and I swore to him that if I ever reached land, I would keep faith with the lamp my wife lit. But when I came ashore in France, broken and penniless, I knew Mortlake's men would silence me if I returned. So I vanished. I let the river keep my name. Only Pike I trusted, and he kept the oath, though his mind cracked under it. Mortlake found him, bent him to his use. And me he paid in scraps while he grew rich on stolen copper." Holmes's voice cut through the confession, sharp as a blade. "And you allowed your wife to mourn you 7 years, to waste her life in vigil, all to spare your own skin." Vale's face twisted with anguish. "I thought to spare her worse. If I returned, Mortlake would use her, strike at me through her. Better she thought me dead, yet comforted by her lamp, than endangered by my presence." Mrs. Vale's voice, though faint, carried a weight that silenced us all. "And what of my choice, John? Was I to have no voice in the matter? You left me to shadows and superstition. A widow in all but truth." He reached toward her with trembling hands, but she drew back, her eyes shining with tears that did not fall. Holmes stepped forward once more. "Vale, your tale is both cowardice and confession. Yet it confirms what I suspected. Mortlake's fraud was built upon your silence. With you alive, the insurance swindle could be proved. That is why he nurtured the grotesque theatre of the lamp, to bind your wife, to keep her from speaking freely, lest she should stumble upon your existence. Pike was the apostle, you the hidden god, Mortlake merely the high priest of profit." At this, Lestrade and his men, who had kept back at Holmes's signal, now came forward. The inspector's expression was a curious mixture of triumph and perplexity. "Well, Mr. Holmes, this is a rare tangle. Mortlake and Pike are in custody, but here stands Vale himself, risen from the dead. What am I to do with him?" Holmes replied without hesitation, "Take him too. His testimony is the key. With his account, Mortlake's fraud can be exposed and the salvage traced. Whether he be villain or victim, the law must judge him." The constables moved to secure Vale, but Mrs. Vale stepped forward, her hand lifted. "Treat him gently," she said softly. "He is broken enough." Vale bowed his head, offering no resistance. As they led him away, he turned once to look upon his wife, but she did not move. Only the lamp, burning steadily above, bore witness to their long parting and its bitter close. When all had departed, Holmes and I remained with Mrs. Vale. She stood in silence, gazing at the flame that had become the center of her existence. At last she spoke, her voice steady though low. "Mr. Holmes, what am I to do now? The lamp has guided me so long. Without it I scarcely know who I am." Holmes regarded her gravely. "Madam, the lamp was but a symbol, twisted by men for their purposes. Its true meaning lies not in superstition, but in constancy. You kept faith, though deceived on all sides. That is your strength. Extinguish it now, if you will, not as surrender but as liberation. Let the flame die, and with it the chains they forged. She drew a long breath, then, with trembling hands, lifted the lamp from its place. For a moment she held it high, the flame shining upon her pale face. Then she blew softly, and the light went out. The darkness that followed was profound, but in it I felt not despair but release, as though a long vigil had ended. Holmes turned to me as we walked back through the fog-bound streets. His voice was low, reflective. "Watson, there are cases where detection uncovers not crime alone but the frailty of the human heart. Vale's cowardice, Pike's madness, Mortlake's greed, all conspired to make a widow's lamp the altar of deceit. Yet in the end, truth is light enough. I glanced back once and thought I saw, in the upper window of the little house, Mrs. Vale standing tall in the darkness. Her face no longer turned to the river, but toward the faint promise of morning. And beside me, Holmes drew his coat close, his gaze already fixed upon the next mystery that waited in the shadows of London. The following days passed with the steady rhythm of official proceedings, though beneath their surface I sensed the turbulence of deeper currents. Mortlake and Sons, once a respected firm of insurers, now stood exposed as architects of a fraud 7 years in the making. Lestrade, with his usual air of self-congratulation, paraded his success at the Yard. Yet he never failed to remind anyone listening that Mr. Holmes lent a hand. Pike, raving in his cell, alternated between prayers to the river and cries for forgiveness from a master who had long since discarded him. John Vale, pale and broken, gave his confession in measured tones, each word the tolling of a bell upon his ruined honor. I accompanied Holmes to the magistrate's hearing, where the charges were laid with cold precision. Vale admitted his survival of the wreck and his silence thereafter, speaking of fear, shame, and the weight of Mortlake's threats. The magistrate's eyes softened for a moment at his mention of the widow's lamp, but duty prevailed. He was remanded for trial alongside Mortlake, though with the court's recognition that he had been more tool than conspirator. Holmes showed little triumph. When we returned to Baker Street, he threw himself into his chair with a sigh that bespoke weariness rather than victory. "Watson, there is a peculiar melancholy about cases such as this. We have unearthed crime, yes, but in doing so we have broken the fragile illusions that sustained a woman's courage. Mrs. Vale's lamp gave her constancy, though it was built upon deceit. Now she must walk in truth, but truth is often the colder companion." I reminded him gently that Mrs. Vale had shown unexpected strength in extinguishing the flame with her own hand. He inclined his head. "Just so. It is a rare thing when the victim of deception can claim mastery over it. Perhaps she will fare better than I suppose." It was 2 days later, as I was preparing to leave Baker Street for my rounds, that Mrs. Vale herself appeared once more. She was composed, though her eyes carried the faint trace of recent tears. Holmes greeted her with grave courtesy, motioning her to the chair she had once occupied, trembling and distraught. "Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, "I have come not with fear, but with gratitude. The truth is bitter, but it is truth nonetheless. I know now that my lamp was made into a chain and I have broken it. Yet I cannot despise those years entirely. They gave me strength I did not know I possessed. For that, oddly, I thank both you and even the flame that deceived me." Holmes bowed his head. "You speak with wisdom, madam. If light deceives, it may still teach us to see more clearly once it is gone. Once it is gone." She rose soon after, pressing his hand briefly before departing. Holmes watched her from the window as she walked into the misty street, her step steadier than before. "There, Watson," he murmured, "is the true conclusion. Not in the court, not in the cell, but in the resilience of one who was made the pawn of men's avarice, and yet emerges unbroken." I thought the matter closed, but Holmes's restlessness in the days that followed suggested otherwise. He spent long hours bent over the copper fragment in the ring, comparing marks, jotting cryptic notes, and even sending telegrams to France and Spain. At last, late one evening, he spoke. "There is one loose end, Watson. The salvage itself. Mortlake profited from ingots that should have lain at the bottom of the sea. Some portion of them was recovered and sold. I would know to whom. If ever you hear of copper circulating in peculiar channels, recall this case." I asked if it mattered now that Mortlake was undone. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Crimes leave trails, Watson, like ships upon the sea. Another mind may trace them if mine does not. It is best to know where they lead. That night, as I set down the final lines of my notes upon the affair, Holmes played his violin softly by the fire. The melody was low, almost mournful, yet with a faint thread of triumph woven through. It seemed to echo all that we had witnessed: the flame in the widow's window, the scarred sailor's devotion, the rise of a man thought drowned, and the greed that had woven them together into a dark tapestry. When at last he laid down the bow, he turned to me with that sudden, disarming candor he sometimes displayed. "Watson, there are moments when I almost envy the ordinary man who accepts appearances and asks no further. Yet it is not in my nature. I must see through the veil, however pitiful the sight beyond. In this case, I pierced superstition to find cowardice, madness, and greed. Still, I cannot deny that the widow's lamp, false though it was, burned with a nobility of its own." I could find no words, and so we sat in companionable silence while the fire sank low. Outside, the fog rolled once more through Baker Street, softening the lamplight until it seemed no more than a pale ghost of flame, fragile, flickering, and for all its frailty, enduring. Thus ended the strange case of the widow who lit a lamp for the dead, a tale of shadows and false resurrections, yet one that left behind not despair, but the faint glow of resilience, like a light carried through darkness by steady hands. And though Holmes dismissed it as one more puzzle solved, I confess that to me it remains among the most haunting of our adventures, for in its quiet way it showed that truth, though cruel, may still be the truest flame by which we guide our lives. The last embers of the case smouldered for several weeks, though to the public it seemed a fire fully quenched. Mortlake and Sons collapsed swiftly once the charges were laid, their names stricken from the rolls of reputable firms. The newspapers reported at length upon the fraud, praising the vigilance of Scotland Yard, while making only guarded reference to Holmes. Pike lingered in confinement, his mind broken beyond recall, while John Vale's fate awaited the judgment of the courts. I visited Mrs. Vale once, finding her quiet, resolute, and already planning to leave St. Catherine's for the countryside where she had relations. She told me she wished to live where no lamp need burn nightly to recall her past. Holmes himself seemed curiously subdued. He had proved every link of the chain: the stolen cargo, the false corpse, the forged miracles of light. Yet some private chord had been struck in him by the spectacle of a woman's faith betrayed. One evening, as we sat together by the fire, I pressed him gently for his reflections. "My dear Watson," he said, "it is not often I find myself moved by sentiment, yet in this affair I cannot escape it. The widow's constancy was admirable, though founded upon deception. Mortlake's scheme was crude in essence, but it succeeded for so long because it drew strength from a truth, that love and loyalty may outlast death itself. That is why Pike clung to it, why the widow endured it, and why Vale himself thought to cloak his shame beneath it. They each found in the lamp a mirror of their own hearts. I remarked that the case had proved once more the triumph of reason over superstition." Holmes smiled faintly. "Reason is the lamp by which we see, Watson, yet it is not always the lamp men choose. Some prefer the flame that comforts even while it deceives. It is my task to trim away the false fire, though I sometimes wonder if I leave the world darker for it. Still, truth is the only light that endures, however cold its gleam." The clock struck midnight and Holmes rose, stretching his long limbs. "Come, Watson, let us consign this case to your notes. I have no doubt you will dress it with more warmth than I, and that is as it should be. For me, the matter is concluded. There are other mysteries waiting, and I must keep my mind free for them, and so it was." Within days he had turned to another puzzle, his energies undimmed, his keen gaze fixed upon new enigmas. Yet for myself, the vision of that small house by the river, its lamp extinguished at last by the widow's own hand, remained etched upon my memory. It seemed to me that in that simple act lay the true conclusion of the whole affair, not in the exposure of Mortlake's fraud, nor in the unmasking of John Vale's cowardice, but in the quiet courage of a woman who chose to end a vigil that had bound her for 7 long years. Thus closed the strange and somber case of the widow who lit a lamp for the dead. If Holmes regarded it as but one more problem solved, I confess that to me it was a lesson in the endurance of the human spirit, and in the way truth, however harsh, may yet free us from the shadows in which deception thrives. And though the lamp is now dark, its memory burns still, a faint but steady glow in the gallery of my recollections of my remarkable friend, Sherlock Holmes.